My dad is a little on the passive side, and my mom was more the authoritative person in our household, and so I bonded strongly with my mom. And so by the time I got to elementary school, I was pretty effeminate, and a lot of the kids called me a girl. But I was realizing that my stuffing my same-sex attractions, they weren't disappearing.
When we shift out of childhood and in this transition of becoming a young man or a young woman and then into full adulthood, the things that we've used to kind of cope with pain and just to try to kind of get through life, those mechanisms wind up being prisons in our adulthood.
It was the first time on my own. I had always been in ministry community, and so I was terrified of living on my own. So it was a very difficult situation, and I found myself in this difficult situation of having to grow up and fend for myself. And I had a computer, and I got lost in porn.
We need Jesus. We need the cross. But here's the other thing we need. We need community.
I was so embarrassed that I had gone through 2.5 years at this ministry, ex-gay ministry, and I hadn't dealt with these issues.
We would just kind of pick up the carpet and sweep more crap under it.
You know, the Bible says, be still and know that I am God. And it's in being still with God that he was able to untangle all these lies and misconceptions in my life that I believed about myself, I believed about God.
God has formed me more and more into a solid man who is thankful and grateful to be a man and know that I actually, there's something weighty, there's something of substance in who I am as a man that I today would not trade for anything.
I just praise God because he did a really deep work in me.
Hey, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us for another episode of the Love and Truth Network podcast. And as I always say, whether you're coming to us through Love and Truth Network or through a connection to Transforming Congregations, we're glad that you're here. We appreciate you tuning in with us. And also, I just want to give you a little bit of encouragement right out of the gate before we get started. If you appreciate these podcasts, if you really value the information that we share and the testimonies that are often shared by our guests, we just encourage you to let people know about these podcast opportunities to jump in, subscribe to our podcast, let your pastors know. I mean, our ministry really exists to equip pastors and Christian leaders in the church to help them be more effective on dealing with a whole range of sexual brokenness that is oftentimes hidden within the church, typically hidden within the church, but yet is such a massive issue within the church. So we want to especially connect with Christian leaders and pastors, church staff. So let your leadership know about these podcasts and that our ministry exists as well. So regardless of all that, we are glad that you're here, and I'm glad that you get to meet our guest today. His name is Joshua Inman, and he is an author. His book is coming out very soon. I'll let him tell you more about that. But Joshua's had quite a journey with the Lord. And Joshua, thanks so much for being with us for this podcast.
Well, thanks for having me. I'm honored to be here.
Yeah, well, we're glad to have you. And I would love for you just to share over 10, 15, maybe 20 minutes, share with our audience some of your story and kind of where you found yourself before coming to Christ and what that looked like and coming to faith in him and what life has looked like, since then as well.
Okay. So I was born and raised just outside of Seattle, Washington, and I was actually raised in a Christian home. So I grew up in the faith. I never wandered from the faith per se. My parents were newly saved right before I was born, and so I kind of grew up in the church context of the church. We grew up in a vineyard church, which is very on the charismatic side. And so I never had to question whether God was real because he was so real to me as a child that there was that foundation laid that I never had to question that. But my dad is a little on the passive side, and my mom was more the authoritative person in our household. And so I bonded strongly with my mom, me and my twin brother. I have an identical twin brother, and we both bonded with my mom. And so we were more effeminate than the average guy. A lot of my family friends that we were a close-knit circle of people, had girls that were my age. And so we dressed up in dresses and played with dolls with them. And my mom allowed it for a time because she thought that kids are curious about things of the opposite sex. but she started to realize we weren't growing out of it. So she started to encourage other forms of play that no longer involved dressing up. And so I started doing it in secret, or, dressing up like a Bible character, because that was the loophole I could find to still kind of dress up in somewhat of a dress. And so by the time I got to elementary school, I was pretty effeminate, and a lot of the kids called me a girl. And me and my twin brother were picked on a lot. We'd come home complaining, and my mom just tried to encourage us to forgive. And it was towards the end of elementary school, my dad and mom separated and later divorced. I had no idea there was any trouble in their relationship because they didn't fight in front of us. But all of a sudden, my dad left, kind of blindsiding our family. And he eventually relocated to Colorado from Washington. And so we really didn't see him much. It devastated my younger siblings, but not so much me, that because I wasn't super close to him. But what I didn't realize until years later, just how drastically his leaving did affect me. I just didn't realize it. So when I was still in elementary school, I was being picked on a lot. I can remember sitting in the playground and asking God, why didn't you make me a girl? Because it would have made life so much easier. And I didn't feel like I was a girl trapped in the body of a boy, but I didn't feel like I fit in with the boys. I felt like I was sitting on this fence with one foot on the girl's side, one foot on the guy's side, not really belonging anywhere. And so I cried out to God, why didn't you make me a girl? But he didn't answer me that day. And I just continued to move forward with whatever, I could. And so once I got into junior high school, that's where the real bullying took place. And if I thought elementary school was bad, that was nothing compared to junior high. I had to take showers with the guys in PE, so they knew I wasn't a girl. So now I was a fag and a sissy and a queer. And that's where the locker room was where the worst bullying took place. I was never physically beat up, but I was definitely picked on. It was like an emotional concentration camp like Cy Rogers talks about. And it was a very difficult time. But God's presence was there even on the dark times, especially on the dark times. But it was in the locker room in 7th grade that my sexual attractions started to emerge. I went through puberty. That's when I started finding myself attracted to all these guys around me. Rumors were spread around the school that I got an erection in the locker room. And it was just this horrific 3-year experience. And while I was in junior high, my mom had assigned us up for Youth with a Mission's King's Kids program, which was starting in my hometown. And so I did a summer outreach in 92 to Spain during the Olympic Games. And then the next year in 93, I went to the Philippines, and I fell in love with the Philippines. And so right after high school, once I got to high school, it was like a breath of fresh air. Most of the bullies pretty much left me alone. I mean, there were still some who picked on me, but for the most part, it seems like they kind of grew up a little and left me alone. But I was realizing that my same-sex attractions, they weren't disappearing. And so it was in junior high that I started masturbating and getting into things of that nature. I tried to talk to my mom, but it was very embarrassing and shameful. And so I kept most of it quiet because I just didn't know how to reconcile these things. I didn't have anybody in my life talking about it in youth group. They weren't talking about anything like this, and I was too afraid to talk to anybody. And in between junior high and high school, my mom married a man who was part of our King's Kids program, and he was the opposite of my dad. My dad was more passive, more quiet. This man could fly into a rage at the drop of the hat, and you never knew what was going to set him off. So I felt like I was on eggshells a lot. I resigned myself into my room where I listened to music for hours, and it was just a really tumultuous time for me. And he tried to be a father, but I was past the point of wanting a father figure. I was going into high school, and we clashed, and it was a really difficult situation. But right out of high school, I moved to the Philippines with YWAM, and I did their discipleship training school. And after the 6-month school, I moved up north to the very northern coast where I had done my outreach. And there was an island just off the northern coast where I felt God's call to help plant a church. And this was a little island with no electricity, very little transportation. They were rice farmers and fishermen, and I just enjoyed learning the lifestyle and the language. And I just it's like, finally, it's like, you know, being white in the Philippines was like being a movie star. So all of a sudden I was popular where I was never popular at school. And so I was shocked that people wanted to be my friend, but these everyday people, the youth and the people around my age, they accepted me. They saw that I was more effeminate. So they tried to help me walk and carry myself more like a man. And they didn't realize it, but these very simple people with no degree in psychology, God used these friendships to start healing the rejection that I had in school. And it was a really healing time. And I feel like God did more for me than I ever did for any of them. But after about 4 years, we had planted a church. And I was the initial one who was there by myself. YWAM didn't have any other representation on the island but me. But then later on, someone came and started working with me towards the end of my time in the Philippines. But when I went to the Philippines in 93, there was a guy who I had met and we kept in contact. He was around my age. And when I came back, he was one of the ones who got me up, met me at the airport and got me where I needed to go for YWAM school. And he his letters started becoming very sexual, and he and I kind of we didn't have sex, but we fooled around a couple times. But he lived 13 hours south of where I was living in the Manila area, and so I barely saw him. So we kind of interacted like twice, which was a good thing. I struggled through my 4 years and the 4.5 years. A good thing that he
was 13 hours away.
Yes.
Right?
Oh my gosh. Right? Yeah. I mean, I was constantly inflamed with lust for all the good looking guys around me, and being in a tropical climate where guys are half naked, you know, it's really difficult. And it had lots of fuel for my lust. And there were opportunities where people either hit on me or presented themselves as an option. But either I was so naive I didn't get it until later, or I was strong that day and was able to resist, and then I'd kick myself later, like, why didn't you take that opportunity? But very thankful God protected me from the stupid situations I put myself in. Right. But I felt like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. I'm there as a missionary trying to plant this church, but I'm inflamed with lust and I didn't understand how things worked. And the devil was tormenting me, telling me I wasn't a good missionary because I wasn't an evangelist and I'm not a preacher. So there's this cookie cutter in my mind of what a missionary truly is. And you don't fit that mold. So you're a failure as a missionary. And there was all these things building up and I was about ready to burn out. And I happened to find this magazine that advertised Exodus International and had some Ann Polk's testimony in it and John's testimony. So I wrote Exodus. They started sending me their newsletters. And that's really when I started reading these stories, that's when I finally admitted to myself, okay, this is what I struggle with. I knew it, but I had never accepted it. And so I finally accepted it. And I went to the local Christian bookstore and I bought all the books I could find on the subject. And through one of them, God told me to go to an Exodus Live-In program, which I didn't know these things existed. I didn't know there was any ex-gay ministry at all, anything like that. And so I left the Philippines. I moved to California outside of San Francisco, and I went to Frank Worthen's New Hope Ministries Live-In program. And I went through their 3-month pre-program. I did their 1-year Steps Out program, and then I did their 1-year leadership and training program. And when I got to the program, I thought if I did the program right, I would come out straight and all these sexual struggles would be a thing of the past. Had no idea what it was really, had no idea that's not how it works. But I quickly realized that's not how it works. So God,
which is very discouraging when you first realize that, right?
Right.
We all want that, but when it finally, we need that adjustment from, to reality. But when reality hits, it's very discouraging because we've been hoping, at some point it's just going to totally go away. Well,
right.
We don't need it to totally go away, but that's what we're hoping for.
Well, and I really feel like a lot of people, like we would start the program with a big group of people, and over the course of the year, people would leave. And I think it's because they were disillusioned, thinking, had wrong expectations, thinking if I just do this, then all my problems will disappear, and that's not life and reality. And so God did some healing in me, but it wasn't like the deep resolving healing that I was hoping for. And so at the end of my Steps Out, or the end of my leadership and training program, Frank closed the ministry, and I was like, okay, what do I do now? And there was a Christian singer named Lisa Daggs, that I was a fan of in high school, and we'd written each other off and on through the years. And I was able to convince Frank to bring her in for a concert for one of our conferences we did. And so I contacted her and said, "Can I work for your ministry?" And she said, "Sure." And so I moved up to Sacramento. It was the first time on my own. I had always been in ministry community. And so I was terrified of living on my own. So it was a very difficult situation. And I found myself in this difficult situation of having to grow up and fend for myself. And I had a computer and I got lost in porn. And that became my solace for this difficult transitionary period, which opened a whole nother door of stuff that I got addicted to, Lisa came out of a drug and alcohol background. So all her music and her concerts were recovery based, and I would sell her merchandise for her at her shows. And I knew I could talk to her, but I was so embarrassed that I had gone through 2.5 years at this ministry, ex-gay ministry, and I hadn't dealt with these issues. And so I was too embarrassed to talk to her, so I didn't. So I kept it as my dirty little secret. And I basically from there got hired with Women of Faith as one of their merchandise sellers and moved to Nashville so I could travel more. And I traveled with some of the biggest names in Christian and country music. I stopped going to church because I was on the road all the time. I never gave up on God, but there was a lot of lies and faulty expectations and ideas that I had about God from my childhood that I was wrestling with. I couldn't make sense of my life. There was a lot of things I couldn't explain. And so I ran from God, and I was terrified. The devil lied to me saying God's not good. He doesn't take care of his people. I believed the lie and I ran, but I knew he was the truth, the way, and the life. And there was no one else but him, but there was things I couldn't reconcile. So it was easy just to put it on the back burner. I got busy touring and lost in pornography, and I ran from God. But one of the artists I was working for told me about a Nashville church plant here in Nashville that they were starting to open. And so I grew up in the Vineyard, so I wanted to be a part of that. So I started attending. I moved in with a pastor not the pastor of the Vineyard, but he was a former Nashville Vineyard pastor, but his church, he'd closed it years before. But I moved in with him, and God started to use the church. I started having a quiet time, started reading the Bible, and it started to change me. I started to, he kind of woke me up from my slumber in a lot of ways. And with the help of this pastor I moved in with, he started encouraging me to take a deeper look at my life, to curb my porn habit. I started having more accountability. And so I started to practice bouncing my eyes, not looking at attractive guys, being careful what I watched, be careful, taking every thought captive. And I did not realize just how difficult those things would be, because I had this magnetic pull that when I would see a guy, it would pull me to look. And if I didn't look, it was very painful. It was almost painful. And so I fell down so many times. I was discouraged. I wanted to give up. I felt this is hopeless. God's expectations are way too hopeless. I felt like God was just waiting for me to get it together. Otherwise he was going to pound me for all these sins. And, the Bible says, come to me with boldness, come into my throne room with boldness. But I was afraid that he would drop the hammer of judgment on me for all this sin and running that I had done. But I finally started pressing in, and I found him just waiting to love me. He wasn't going to drop the hammer because the hammer fell on Jesus when he was crucified for my sins. And I failed to recognize that. And so he showed me that I was his son, that I was not a beggar on the streets of his kingdom, that my sexual struggles and my things didn't disqualify me from sonship. And I started to practice solitude with God, and I started practicing fasting. And through all these things, God called me to write a book about my story. I'd always wanted to write a book about my life, but I just never thought I would. And in the end of 2019, he really put this urgency in my heart to write my book. And so in 2020, I found through a God story, I found a writing coach, and she moves very strongly with the Holy Spirit. So between her and the Holy Spirit, they helped me process my past. I wrote the first draft myself, and then we did 9 drafts after that over the last 5 years. And the Holy Spirit brought healing and deep inner healing and restoration through stuff that I buried. I didn't realize I was carrying. He would reveal things, and I'm like, oh my gosh, I had no idea that was even an issue. But what's really interesting to me is the deepest healing that he did in my life was wrapped around my relationship with my father. And I had no idea because I wasn't close to my dad. It just was mind-boggling to me just how drastic of a healing that was. But he broke the stronghold of my sexual addiction. I no longer have that magnetic pull. I now find it a lot easier to bounce my eyes and curb my mind. I'm now at this moment, I am 3.5 years porn free, and I'm coming up on 4 months free from masturbation. I still struggle with that on occasion, but it's no longer the habitual issue it was, because that stronghold of sexual addiction has been broken. And so I just praise God because he did a really deep work in me. And it did cause me to walk through some pain to get to the other side. But oh my gosh, I was so shut down emotionally, and I had these walls up, and God helped me chip all that away. And he kind of reintroduced me to myself, especially through the writing of the book. And it just really changed my life. And so writing the book wasn't just about writing a book. I feel like he set me up. It was about, he wanted to do this deep
he
healing.
Does that sometimes.
Oh yeah. Mm-hmm. He wanted to do this deep healing in me, but he used the avenue of the book to be able to do the stuff. But I don't know how I could have healed any other way. I really don't, because he used that as the vehicle, and my writing coach she was like a counselor to me, and it was an amazing experience. I'm so thankful for it. But anyway, that's my life kind of in a nutshell. Yeah. I'm sure I've left out a lot,
but you have a book.
But I have a book, and it's coming out in March. It's called Identity Lost and Found.
So good. I love the cover.
Yeah, thank you. I'm very, very excited. It's almost ready, but I'm hoping it'll be out in March, but at the very latest. So I'm very excited.
Yeah, that's great. That's exciting. And we're glad. We need more and more of the stories of transformation, whether that's out of LGBTQ, whether that's heterosexual, sexual brokenness, whatever. There's so much of it there, and we need to get our stories out and really give God glory for what he's done in our lives, but also give other people hope because of what he's done in their life, because that gives us a sense that if he can work in your life with all this stuff going on, and all of us, it doesn't even matter, straight guys that have never dealt with same-sex attraction and vice versa. I hear from people all the time, oh my gosh, like, I heard your story and I went in a completely different direction, but I can see, like, I'm kind of surprised I didn't go down some of the same paths that you did, because I had a lot of the same issues, a lot of the same stuff that you explain. Not all of it. Obviously, our stories are different. Even your story and my story is radically different. And yet, as you were sharing, there are some big, big common themes in your story that completely connect, with my story as well. So anyway, Joshua, thanks so much for sharing that with us. I just want to jump in for those
real quick. Can
watching.
I say something real quick?
Oh yeah, please.
I was just going to say, the biggest cry of my heart that God revealed to me was that I was asking my whole life, do I matter? And he showed me not only did I matter to him, but my pain mattered. And he poured out so much love on me that I'm now secure in him, in his love, that nothing else really matters anymore. And I'm not searching for that love because I've found it in him. But also, I think that what I've learned from my experience and the healing God brought in me, we all have, no matter what we struggle with, we all have defense and coping mechanisms that we've built up from childhood to protect us. And God wants to set us free from all of that. And it doesn't matter what expression it takes, whether it's drugs and alcohol or sex or whatever. He wants to set us free. And just dealing with those issues is like putting a Band-Aid on it until those deeper needs are met and healed. And he is so good at that, at bringing those healings, if we'll allow him and not distract ourselves.
Yep. Yep. So true. I mean, everything you said there, that's a lot and very, very important. And I know people listening or viewing the podcast connect with what you're saying there in some fashion. We see people all the time who are in their 40s or 50s, 60s, even 70s, who are just beginning to glimpse, or they came to us knowing that they had an issue, but they had no idea of all of the underlying pain that they were
Mm-hmm.
still experiencing
Mm-hmm.
and the disconnect that was there. And the truth is, like, what I'm explaining right now is not unusual. It's the typical human experience. And what we oftentimes forget, and people who follow me have heard me say this a number of times before, but it bears repeating. What we oftentimes do not realize is that the very things that help us survive as children, because we have no choice, like we're just going to get bounced along in some fashion. I mean, rarely do we have choices. As kids, there's certain things. Obviously, when abuse is happening, we can and should talk to mom or dad. But sometimes, what do you do if mom or dad is the abuser, or what do you do if there's just if they just brush it aside and they don't believe you, or they think you're making too much of it, or they're trying to protect the other person, or I mean, the film. There's all kinds of, and sometimes they take real action. Like in my case, there was a cutting off of the connection to the older boys who did introduce me to sexual things at 5 and 6 years of age, and also some abuse, but also hardcore porn. There was an ending of that, but there was no knowledge on their part that there was anything more that needed to happen in terms of
Mm.
what had already happened to me needing to unpack that stuff. So, regardless, my point in all this is that when we shift out of childhood and in this transition of becoming a young man or a young woman and then into full adulthood, the things that we've used to kind of cope with pain and just to try to kind of get through life, to escape from the pain we're experiencing, or what you described, and I experienced it too. The locker room was a nightmare. It
Mm-hmm.
was, I mean, school was a nightmare for me. Just walking down the hallways was this ritual
Oh
of
yeah.
name calling and
Yeah.
sissy, fag, queer, and all the
Yep.
stuff that you're talking
Yeah.
about, and getting tripped and knocked down, getting books knocked out. I mean, it was all the time shifting from one class to another. And um and and bullies were actually like looking, for me in particular, and I'm sure some other poor kids as well. But the way that we cope with that, and the way that we kind of shut down and detach because we have no other choice than to be there, um, those
Survival mode.
mechanisms wind up being prisons in our adulthood.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so those protections as childhood wind up binding us. And we need Jesus. We need the cross. But here's the other thing we need community. When
Mm-hmm.
Jesus raises Lazarus from the dead, he himself does not run over and take off his grave clothes. And he doesn't say, Lazarus, take off those grave clothes. He tells the community to take off the grave clothes. And it's a great picture of how we need the community to help free us from the coping mechanisms and the things that are now binding us. They once protected, but now they're too tight. It's a skin that we need to outgrow, and we need the community to help us with that. And most of the time, we resist that because of our shame, our pride, or our fear. I mean, you described that really well. So
Well, it's
I
like
don't know.
it's like
Yeah, go
the
ahead.
it's like the what I learned is I distracted myself because I was terrified to come into the presence of God because I thought he was going to punish me from all these things. And the
Yep.
devil lied to me about that, kept me running. And really, what I needed was to come in stillness with God because it was in the stillness. And, the Bible says, be still and know that I am God. And it's in being still with God that he was able to untangle all these lies and misconceptions in my life that I believed about myself, I believed about God. One time after I fell into masturbation for the millionth time, I said to God, why are you still around? Why haven't you given up on me? And he said, because I'm not your father. And I didn't realize I was viewing God through this lens of my father. And I think we have it's our parents are very broken people, and as a kid you don't understand that, and you get wounded and hurt. And looking back as an adult, I can look back at old childhood hurts and be like, that's not a big deal. But to God it is, because we're still holding on to it, and there's all these little pockets of pain that we've hidden and covered up that we don't realize are still affecting how we view life and how we move into life and what the decisions we make. And he wants to free us from all of that.
Yeah. No, exactly. And as you said, our parents are very broken. The truth is every parent is broken.
Yes.
Melissa and I raising our two boys, we're broken, and we don't do it perfectly by a long shot.
Right.
And yet we do try to be very intentional about always coming back around when we've blown it and asking for their forgiveness,
Mm-hmm.
explaining how we sinned against them, and
Mm-hmm.
and trying to be, rather than doing what was often done in not only my family background, you probably could agree with this, but I mean, I'd love for you to speak into it, but also in church in general, was we would just kind of pick up the carpet and sweep more crap under it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
We just didn't talk about the
Mm-hmm.
stuff that was difficult. We certainly didn't talk about anything sexual. That's for darn sure.
Yeah.
And so what we're trying to do is really sweep that crap out and expose it, bring it to the light, and pick up and move forward with with few offenses or smaller offenses, and we're bringing those to the cross and getting those things cleaned up. And the boys are amazing about extending forgiveness to us, and us to them, that kind of thing. But man, none of us do it perfectly. That's for
Mm-mm.
darn sure.
Mm-mm.
But what you were saying in the beginning of your story, you were talking about dress up with girls and those kinds of things, and that was very much. I think when you and I were talking originally before even coming into the podcast and getting reacquainted, for our listeners, it's funny because both you and I recognize each other, and it took us quite a long time to figure out. Wait a minute, what conference, what situation? Finally, I think we
Right.
nailed it down to where our paths crossed at least once. I think it's been multiple times in the past. But one of the things that you were describing in your story, and I really relate to this, is feeling like, and the way I described it is, I got to a place where I was so exasperated, and I felt like I know that I'm a boy, and yet I don't feel like I have the internal makings. I didn't feel like I was a girl trapped in a boy's body. I didn't have that kind of framework at all, but I just felt like I don't know what this mysterious thing is that boys and men have, but I don't feel like I have whatever that is, or that series of things are. And I felt like I was a third gendered thing. That's
Hmm.
and
Hmm.
and and again, didn't feel like I should be a girl necessarily, but yet I wish that I had been a girl, because I felt like emotionally and all of my interests, like they aligned more with girls. I did go through a period of time as well of dressing, of when no one was around, sneaking one of my mom's dresses and putting that on. And I, if that had been allowed to continue, or if there had been a mechanism by which that could have continued, I think it would have set in so much more deeply. And if I were 10, 11, 12 in this culture, and the way things are now, I have no doubt, especially if I was in public school, man, I would be labeled as trans, and I would have,
Mm-hmm.
I mean,
Mm-hmm.
I don't even know the crazy direction my life would have possibly gone in.
Absolutely. I'm so thankful my parents didn't push me into that we had a solid foundation for the Bible and for God and church. My mom had a real relationship with God. It wasn't just a Sunday morning, we're
Yeah.
going to go to church, but she really had a relationship with God, and she tried to teach us the same. And so I was very thankful for that, because if I was born in today's day and age and my teachers pushed that on me, I can't say that I wouldn't have taken it, because
Yep.
that's what felt. I fit into that more than I felt like I fit in with the boys. And the boys made it
Yep.
super clear I did not measure up.
Yes, exactly. And something I just want to highlight a little bit more from what you just said, if teachers had been pushing me into that, and a lot of people may feel like, well, yes, there are some teachers who have an agenda, and maybe they do push kids in that direction, but that's very rare. But what's not rare is that are the teachers who bring it up all the time. And we might not look at that as being, oh, well, they're just giving options. When you give a child the option, when you teach them the lie that boys may not be boys and girls may not be girls, that there is no kind of fixed idea, that it's this spectrum, and you pull out uh, the genderbread, and the unicorn thing that they use to explain all these different gender ideologies, and you're on this spectrum and this range. When you do that over and over to children and just present them this idea of a possibility which is utterly biologically impossible for a boy to become a girl and the girl to become a boy, but just by raising this often, like I've had parents tell me that their children are being asked daily how they identify today
Hmm.
before they open the class up.
Hmm.
Now, and people might think, oh, well, that's not really pushing it. It absolutely is, because you're planting a seed in
Hmm.
the very wet cement of a little child who is, when I say wet cement, I mean they're just unbelievably pliable and can easily believe things that are not true. So when you're introducing these ideas, you actually are pushing in a way that should never be done, just by even bringing up the potential for something that is non-reality. Do you,
Well,
do you
and
have thoughts about that,
well, I really
Joshua?
believe, I agree with all of that. I really believe that there are people, like you said, who are intentional trying to confuse
Yeah,
kids and further the agenda. But I do think that there's a lot of parents and a lot of teachers who think they're doing the right thing, and they really are
absolutely.
trying to help these kids, and they really feel like that's helping, and it's not.
Yes.
And all the devil needs is a little confusion, and he can go in there with his lies, because we know the Bible calls him the father of lies, and he never stops lying to us. And all he needs is someone to question whether they're a boy or a girl, and that's his playground. And
Yep.
it's you see it rampant today. And I know, like, it's not just teachers and parents, but also like there are like on TikTok and on Instagram, there's activists pressuring people, and
Oh, absolutely.
people feel completely like what do you call it? They feel pressured into it, like peer pressured into it almost. And there's also people who aren't popular, and then they come out like this, and then they become popular, and it's a way to avoid being unpopular or whatever. And when you're a kid, you feel like school life is all there is. You have no concept of life after, or how these things are going to affect you later.
Right.
And so I'm so thankful my parents didn't push, or that wasn't a thing back then,
Well, and what you're describing, I feel like is kind of the proverbial carrot and stick situation, where you have the carrot, for those of us who were unpopular and didn't fit in and felt that keenly. And of course, every kid feels that on some level. And some of the
Right.
most popular kids and adults, frankly, are some of the most insecure people out there. But the carrot, though, this the experience of being celebrated because you're living your true self as a little boy or a young man or girl who is, so-called transitioning into the other gender, and everybody's celebrating it, and there's so much excitement around it, and now, you're popular. Well, that's incredibly powerful in shifting and moving a child in that direction. And
Yes.
then but then we
Right.
see this also with detransitioners. I have friends, you probably do too, who realized, oh my gosh, what am I doing? And I've how, to whatever degree whether they have desisted or they've actually detransitioned. Desisted being those who found help and support to not go down the pathway of either taking cross-sex hormones or having surgery of any kind. But for the detransitioners, they have done that to some degree. And I know ones who have had both top and bottom surgery and all this, and realized one day, what in the world have I done? What have I
Mm-hmm.
allowed to
Mm-hmm.
what have these adults done to me?
Right.
And we but as soon as you start as somebody who is supposedly transitioned or is in this process of transitioning, if you start to question the dogma, if you start to in any way wonder, have I made the right decision? Man, talk about the stick. I mean,
Mm.
there is so much attack against you, and Chloe Cole is one who experiences this. I mean, she's a nationally known individual who is fighting for the rights of children to not be mutilated and destroyed.
Well, it's funny
By
to me how
Yep.
they say, "Oh, gender's a spectrum" or whatever, but it's only one way. You can't go back.
Exactly.
It's like, that's not right.
No, right. Yeah, that's very true. It's a spectrum, but it's only in one direction, supposedly.
Right.
And then also the cry that goes out about conversion therapy. I'm like, you know what? I used to say that the idea of conversion therapy, where there were terrible things. We've acknowledged all the time. There have been some horrible things done many, many decades ago against particularly men who were found with other men either having sex, or it was people realized that these guys, somebody was gay or whatever, and identified that way or was living that way.
Mhm.
And there were some terrible things done to people back then in terms of electroshock therapy and other types of behaviors and things I think were awful. This should have never been done. We would condemn as Christians for sure. But this idea of conversion therapy is so utterly ridiculous that it's built up as being this huge boogeyman and this horrible, awful form of quote unquote therapy, which of course there is no such thing actually as conversion therapy, but it's built up as this thing. And then you have laws being passed in Canada and in other states in our country as well, in other parts of the world, where it's illegal. It's now come down to conversion therapy. Conversion therapy is even a pastor praying with somebody who comes to them asking for prayer or asking for help and support to overcome behaviors and desires that they know don't align with, like,
Right.
they have a right of self-determination. They want to align with the scriptures. They see clearly what the scriptures teach, regardless of all the crap that's out there saying, no, the Bible doesn't actually teach that. They see that that's true. And they're coming and looking for help and support. All of that is being swept under this big carpet or banner of conversion therapy. And here's my point: is I used to think that conversion therapy wasn't real. The truth is, it is real, but like you said, it's going in the other direction.
Mm-hmm.
When in Canada, the only thing you can do is, by law, is redirect a person who doesn't believe that this is right for them, that maybe they want a family down the road, a natural family. They want, as a man, to have a wife and to have children. They don't want their life to be given over to just, the best I can do is be with another man and maybe marry him or whatever. Whatever the reasons, the only thing that is being allowed is for them to be pushed down this conveyor belt of the LGBTQ perspective and agenda. And that is the very thing they're calling conversion therapy is happening in the reverse.
Right. Well, and it's so funny because it's, like you said, they're being fast tracked on this thing, and it's so demonic. I mean, what shows you how demonic it is that it's one-sided. You can go one way, but you can't go another. And they say, oh, we're the party of science. And it's like, please. But, even if people do feel like they were born in the wrong body, all is not lost, because Jesus is in the business of restoration, and he is the true conversion therapist, because aren't we all supposed to die to ourselves and be born again? I mean, that's true conversion therapy, right? Or, that's what that is.
True conversion.
Conversion. Yep. And, it's like, he's the one who transforms us. And, when I started working on the book and I started looking at my life, I felt like I was in this jungle, and all I could see was the tangled vines and knots. And I'm like, how did I get here? But he remembers every step in the path that took me there. I may not remember, but he does. And he told me, if you will place your hand in my hand, I will lead you out. And he's been doing that. And nothing is impossible for him. And no confusion is too great that he can't bring healing and restoration to. And he knows exactly where we're at and what we need, what that little, because we all have that one place that unlocks so much that he knows exactly. We're all uniquely broken, so there's a unique cure for each of us, even though there's similar things that we've all had to face and go through to find our healing. But he gave us our gender as a blessing. And that was hard for me to reconcile at first, because, I just didn't feel like a man. I could say I was, I knew I was a guy, but I couldn't say I was a man. And especially in junior high, I felt so inferior and I felt like such a failure. But now I can say I'm a man, where I couldn't say that before. And I realized, he didn't make a mistake. None of this is a mistake, no matter what the world tells us, no matter how we feel. But God has the answer and the solution if we'll just turn to him and trust him and follow where he leads.
Yeah, and speaking of healing and restoration, you've mentioned this a few times, but I want to loop back around to your father. I have a friend who right after my friend's mom and biological father had sex, and he was born, 9 months later, that his biological father just left the mother. He's never known who this man is, and in that place of in that gap of never knowing, it was easy for him to assume, don't let the door hit you on the way out. I mean, just I didn't need you. Obviously, you didn't want to stick around and have anything to do with your son. You've not come and looked for me. As I've gotten older, I've not drawn any of your attention, for you to even think about me, and so therefore, I don't need you either. And it was really easy for years and years and years for him to feel like this was just a kind of an empty, useless situation, relationship, or lack of relationship. It's hard to even describe it because he didn't feel anything toward him except, anger on some level. But even that was even difficult to get in touch with because he'd never experienced him. And it wasn't until many, many years later that God began to impress on my friend just how much he missed in not having this father around. Of course, it was difficult to press into that because he had spent years convincing himself that it was utterly unnecessary. So not only was he kind of in a neutral place, he had this really entrenched view that he didn't need his father, that it was better that he wasn't even there, but he needed to recognize that a massive part of God's design for a boy, for a daughter too, it could be, but for a child is to have both parents, both mom and dad, which is one of the reasons it's so devastating when gay couples, either somehow have children or adopt children. It's not that they can't love them well. It's not, they may love them incredibly well, but they are choosing to rob that child of the other part of the image of God that they so desperately need to grow up into and be influenced by, which is what God designed in natural families with moms and dads. So, can you unpack a little bit more of the process that you needed to kind of go through? And I don't mean in a formulaic way, but just maybe unpack a little bit more about how you needed to get in touch as a man yourself with the loss of your father and the divorce that happened, and the absence really of his influence in your life.
Well, for me, part of it was to realize, we in our society hold up the Marlboro man kind of as like, this is manhood. If you don't fit that cookie cutter, then there's something wrong with you, kind of a thing.
Yep.
And to realize that I don't like sports. And maybe that was because of my, the things I struggled with in life. I was more into reading and music and the more the artsy type stuff. I'm not an artist per se, but like I don't draw or paint or any of that. But, I realized that there's not one size fits all and that God made us, like you could say, on a spectrum or all different. And there's no set standard, and that it's okay that I don't like sports, and it's okay that I'm the way I am. God made me that way. Some of it may be residue or consequence of things that I learned behavior.
Yep.
But it doesn't disqualify me, and it doesn't matter to God. I mean, he doesn't mind that I'm a little more effeminate than most guys, and it doesn't matter. And so when I accepted that and realized it's okay that I don't have to live up to a straight standard, that was huge. Like Cy Rogers, when I was in the ministry at New Hope, Cy Rogers came and he talked about God. He said the goal is not to become straight because straight people go to hell. It's redeemed people that go to heaven. And God really showed me that because I was trying to live up to some straight standard, and it just felt like this mountain that I had to climb up that I just couldn't climb up. And I felt like God was like, relax, I'm not expecting this of you, and it's okay that you don't live up to what this cookie cutter that you feel you need to live up to. And so, but years later, after I got out of the program, I started to realize, God started to show me just how drastically my dad's leaving had affected me. It shifted the stability, shook the stability I had. And, I had a very tumultuous, my stepmom, that my dad married was a lot like my stepfather. She could fly into a rage at the drop of a hat. I never felt like I could just be myself around at their house. And there were times that Dad he was supposed to come get us for his weekend visits, and he wouldn't come. And I remember waiting at the top of the hill for hours, waiting for him to come, and just to find out he wasn't coming. And he remembers, on his side, there were times we didn't want to go, although I don't remember ever saying I don't want to go, but he remembers situations like that. And it was just a very difficult time for all of us. But there were interactions I had with my dad and stepmom over the years that I got angry, and letters that we wrote back and forth when I finally wrote my dad and poured out all my anger about all the stuff that I felt wronged. And he gave his side of things, and there were miscommunication. And when I pulled out all these letters to reference them for my book, I realized I'd read them sloppily, and there were many things that I held against them that they never said, that I read into their letter that they never said. And I had to humble.
That's such an important point.
Yeah.
That I really want to drive home is how, and we can think, no, I know that this was said. I know that you wrote this to me.
Right.
And because our emotions can so easily interpret things.
Filter
and
things
time
through.
Goes by. Yeah. Such an important point. Keep going though, Josh.
And so I had to humble myself and write to my stepmom and my dad and apologize for things I held against them that they never said, that I was convinced they said. And also in writing the book, I had to look at I wrote about not just my life, but I wrote a little bit about my parents to kind of show that, I may have somewhat been a blank slate when I was born, but I wasn't born into a blank slate. And so I kind of show how they were raised, to kind of show how I was parented. And to do that, I had to take a honest look at my dad, and it gave me compassion for him, and it shifted my opinion. And God showed me that I was viewing him through this lens of pain, and I didn't realize that. And so as I started to take an objective look at him, I got compassion, and I started reaching out to him. And a couple of years ago, I flew down to Arizona where he's living, and I reconciled with him and my stepmom. And my stepmom died a year later, but I still have a relationship with my dad. I don't call him as often as I should, but I call him every handful of times a year at least. Whereas before, I wasn't talking to him at all, hardly at all. And so God's been slowly restoring that relationship. And it's like there's a song. I don't know if you've ever heard of the rapper, Christian rapper. His name is NF. And he was, he grew up outside of Detroit, and his mother was a drug addict, and he pours all of his, I don't like rap, by the way, but my brother sent me the song he wrote called Why Did You Leave Us? And it's his mom overdosed on drugs and she died, and he pours all of his pain into this lyrics. And there's some really emotionally charged songs in there. And God used this song, Why Did You Leave Us, to tear open this wound of why my dad left. And it was through this song that God helped really bring that deep healing of showing me, my pain mattered to him, and I mattered, and he was not my father, and my father was a broken man, and he does not represent I think we naturally look at our parents, we view God through the lens of our parents. I did. Yep. And so,
especially our dads.
Yeah, exactly. And God showed me that he's nothing like the representation that I had. And so it changed so much for me.
I love that. There's a couple of other things I want to really hit before we wrap up our podcast. One of them is you were talking about moving in with this pastor, and it just struck me again, and I say this a lot, but there is such power in knowing truth and in preaching and teaching and really and in our own study of the scriptures. All of those things are essential. Those are foundational for sure. But there's also something that I found. My life has changed and was set on a different trajectory because of some of the Christian families that invited me to live with them for a period of time. just being in an environment, not just getting time with them occasionally, being over for dinner, as nice as that is and as helpful, and God bless those that did that for sure. But for those who said, you know what, we have a spare room, or in one of my buddy friends' cases, you know what, we have a large bedroom that both of our boys can move into, and you can have this room to just recuperate for a number of months or whatever, kind of open ended, and those experiences for me of being in a godly Christian environment, imperfect, but an environment where the fruit of the Spirit was really evident: love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control, where those things were really lived out, and to be loved and kind of a part of their family, that was so deeply transformational for me. It reminds me of Rosaria Butterfield's, I think it's her third book,
Mm-hmm.
called The Gospel Comes with a House Key. And so I would love for you. One of the things you said is that this pastor and other people kind of in your life didn't have a degree in psychology, and I oftentimes say that about the men's group that welcomed me in as well. Is these guys were just like redneck hunters, and from upstate New York, and none of them had degrees in anything, counseling, psychology, but they just understood that I was not uniquely broken. I had some unique things I was dealing with that they didn't deal with, and they acknowledged that, but they just saw me as one of them. They did the opposite of what had been done. And I was in my mid 30s at this point. They did the opposite of what had been done throughout my entire childhood and through a lot of my adulthood around other Christians, which was, oh, get out of here. You're this, you're that, you're not
Mm-hmm.
one of us.
Mm-hmm.
And they welcomed me in and put their arms around me and drew me in. Those experiences were radically transformational. I'd love for you to speak to that a little bit more of your own experience.
Well, so yeah, I'm still living with this pastor here in Nashville, and I also my vineyard pastor. The two of them, I really felt like so that my church family, my pastor and his wife, they became family to me. The pastor I'm living with became family to me, and there were times they would speak truth and love to me when I needed it. The pastor I live with sometimes, I felt like he would hold me to an unrealistic expectation. But part of it was because of the stronghold of sexual addiction that I had that I didn't even realize at the time that I had. And so I felt like the bar was so high, but they were patient with me and they gave me all the room in the world to work things out. They didn't hold unrealistic expectations that, oh, it's been a month, you need to be cured by now. They gave the Holy Spirit room to work in my life, and they spoke truth to me and spoke encouragement to me when I needed it and when they felt led to. The pastor I live with, he for years said to me, God's not mad at you, he's mad about you. And it took me a very long time to believe that. And it wasn't really until God started pouring out his love on me and showing me how much he truly did love me that I really started believing that. Because before it just felt like wishful thinking. And I couldn't receive it because it was so good to hear, but it felt like wishful thinking until I got that revelation. But I'm very thankful for those times because they have been like family. And, I'm single, and it's nice to have, even though we don't hang out all the time, we'll watch movies occasionally, or we'll go to concerts or go to dinner on occasion. But, it's not like we hang out every night and do stuff together. And, I really do feel like there's some friends of mine who struggle with homosexuality who have unrealistic expectations of their pastor. They think their pastor needs to answer every call they do and every text message. And when they don't get what they feel they are owed or they deserve or they need, they get angry and leave the church. And I'm like, you have unrealistic expectations. It's like, it's not everyone else's job to meet your needs. God is our source, not other people. But that's where we need to get it, our source, because otherwise it becomes an idol in our life, these people and these relationships. And so I'm just really thankful for the grace that was extended to me in these situations, because it really helped me, gave me room to really grow and work things out. And they challenged me at times, and I didn't like it, but it was stuff I needed to hear. And so, God used all of it. And there was one time when I was struggling with pornography still, and I knew I needed to stop, but I didn't know how to do it. And God used a I was talking about my time at New Hope on Facebook, and this guy I didn't know started sending me private messages, challenging me, telling me that it's my view that are causing all these gay people to kill themselves. And I mean, just really tore me apart. All you ex-gay people say you're ex-gay, but you still watch porn, so you're really not ex-gay. And I just felt shredded, and I was trying to respond in love and grace. But I felt like God used that very hurtful conversation to put a mirror up in my face to show me the ugly truth that I didn't want to face. And it was the kick in the butt I needed to really, really get focus on letting go of the porn. And it was a very difficult situation, but it was a very difficult journey. But and I realized the devil lives in discouragement, and he just waits for us to fall, to pound us, to get us to give up and pack it in. And I was like, I am not giving in no matter how hard this is. But he uses everything for our good, whether they're bad conversations. I mean, I talked about shame on Facebook the other day, about how some shameful memories came up, and I was able to sit with God in silence and process it with him. And people were like, oh, that's the devil. He's trying to attack you. Well, whether it's the devil or God's exposing it, God uses that and can say, hey, you still have this. Let's work on this. Yes. Whether the devil brings it up to shame us or whether God's exposing it so that we can deal with it, it doesn't matter, because it's still there, and God wants to bring healing to those things. And so
that's exactly right. And so whatever it is, if it causes us to run to him,
yeah,
I mean, what could be better in any situation, right? Whether we've failed and we have to go back and ask for forgiveness, or the enemy's bringing up some crap and we're not fully free of it, and we have whatever the issue, or there's genuine guilt, or again, over something that we've done. Whatever the issue, we need to be running to the Father, and
he's a good Father, and he loves us, and he wants to bring restoration and wholeness and healing. But a lot of times what I did in the past is, because I didn't understand that, I would just sweep it under the rug and push it down and pretend like it wasn't there, but it doesn't make it go away.
Yep. And what you described earlier about those that have unrealistic expectations, that was me in spades. I mean, I was looking to everybody. I was so emotionally and spiritually immature that I expected everybody else to meet my needs, especially leaders, to meet my needs. I was highly offended about everything under the sun. In a lot of, I'd been trained to expect shame constantly,
Mm-hmm.
and I think you have too. And so it was a lot of years of unraveling and beginning to embrace the masculinity that God has called us to. So I want to shift to something else, but to do that, I want to jump back to something you said earlier and make a connection in that we all have growth to do, whether we've ever experienced same-sex attraction or gender dysphoria or anything like that. Purely, totally heterosexual, whatever, any range of things. Every young person, boy, girl, every man and woman is still on a trajectory of growth and maturity if they will engage with God in that. And here's what I mean by that, is that for those of us who have experienced same-sex attraction, for those of us particularly who have really have leaned into, like I've really embraced what I'd refer to now, and this is through my understanding of this through like Living Waters and Desert Stream Ministries and Andrew Comiskey's teachings and things, is that I really leaned into a false feminine. I didn't feel like I could measure up as a man, and so therefore I just, as I kind of tried that as a boy or leaned into that, I just failed over and over again. I finally just gave up on that at some point. I don't even know when, but definitely leaned into more of what seemed to fit me better within the world of the feminine, girls, playing with them, being with them, all the stuff that they were interested in. And a lot of that confusion, this was a piece of the puzzle, not the puzzle, but a lot of that behavior is what opened the door for me not to know who I was in relationship to my own gender with other boys and things like that, and opened up all kinds of questions in my own mind. And so that wound up developing, in a lot of ways, this embrace of this false feminine. I experienced that when I lived as a gay bartender, gay man in the club world and all that kind of stuff. And so part of what God needed to redeem me from was, yes, the behavior, but there's also been a redemption in terms of who I am as a man made in his image. And so I've been around people, like I've gone to conferences as you have. I've gone to it and have gone to those annual conferences, and I'll see people and connect with people who I care about a lot who've come out of out of homosexuality. I'm thinking of some guys in particular, but it seemed like there was a desire to break the behavior, but a real camping onto a real latching onto that kind of feminine aspect of who they were, and an unwillingness to let some of that go and to really begin to mature as a man. That doesn't mean that they needed to love sports. It doesn't mean that they needed to, but I want to continue to grow as a man made in God's image. And so even though I still, I'm aware that I still have some feminine voice inflection or mannerisms or whatever, but they're very, very different. They have morphed over time. I wanted God just to take it all away, and make me into this butch guy. Well, that's not going to happen. That's never, that's not what he does. But over the course of time, is I have not made an idol out of this false feminine, but I've been willing for God to be Lord of not just my sexuality, but my identity and the whole thing. God has formed me more and more into a solid man who is thankful and grateful to be a man, and know that I actually, there's something weighty, there's something of substance in who I am as a man that I today would not trade for anything. And I felt like I was completely lacking as a young person. But I say that, and you can loop back to this if you want to, but to kind of segue into this perspective of, the four main perspectives, and we'll talk about three of them primarily within the church on LGBTQ. And of course, one of those perspectives is the mainline church and others, some non-denominational churches as well, who have rejected clear biblical teaching and have revised the Bible to say basically what they want to say, which is, oh, gay relationships are perfectly fine. God made you that way. You can have your husband have a great relationship with God. It's on par with heterosexuality. Well, certainly most evangelical Christians, Orthodox Christians, certainly reject that because the Bible is abundantly clear on that. But another perspective, that first category is often referred to as side A, or pro-gay theology. Side B would say, oh, I'm gay, or I'm trans, or I'm queer, or I'm whatever the thing is, but I'm whatever the identity is. And I know I can't act on that. I can't have sex with my friend or whatever, but I'm still gay, or I'm still trans. And they would applaud somebody who approves of that and hyphenates that to their Christianity and embraces that as an identity, just don't act on it. And you and I talked a little bit about this in an earlier conversation, but I feel like that is such a fault line, that perspective that for many people, they think, oh, that's the best there is out there because they know the alternative is side A. But there's actually this other category, which is more described as kind of like transformational ministry, where we believe not that God pulls out his wand and poof, turns us from gay to straight or trans to whatever, but rather that he takes us on this discipleship journey. And we need to not only let the behaviors go and nail those to the cross. When I say let them go, sometimes wrestle, to get free of them, but also we need to allow him to be Lord of our identity and to crucify false identity to the cross as well. And so part of that allows us to begin to grow up from boys into men, and from little girls into women made in the image of God. I'd love for you to kind of speak into that, whatever that kind of prompts in your own heart or mind, Joshua.
Well, when it comes to churches accepting homosexuality, I just really feel like people are just deceived and they really don't understand. And they're trying to help people. I really do believe that most of it's not an intentional thing, but they really are trying to help people. They're like the parents and the teachers that are ignorant who just don't understand. They think they're being loving and kind. But people have said to me for years, they're like, oh, just find a man and be happy. And I said, the Bible says that we're not allowed to do this. And they're like, oh, God's going to be okay with it. And I said, well, when I stand before God someday, I can't say, well, he said I could do it. That's going to mean nothing. And so really all we have to stand on is the Bible. And so people have tried to discredit the Bible because they want it to say what it doesn't say. And they're trying to say, if you get into the Greek, it really doesn't say what you think it says. But really, we have the Spirit of God living in us that if we're truly His and we've been baptized in the Spirit, we have the Holy Spirit. And that gives us discernment and we can make those decisions. But, I've been reading, when I was back in the Philippines, I read Bob Davies and Lori Rensel wrote a book called Coming Out of Homosexuality. And that was, God used that book to show me that I needed to go to that live-in program. But I pulled it out just the last several months and I've been rereading it. And I wish I would have read it every year over the last 20 years because there's so much in there that conclusions I came to. But one of the things they said is every homosexual is a heterosexual buried under a mountain of insecurity. And I'm like, well, that's me right there. I can relate to that all so much. But I think that, anyway, so going to the side A and side B thing, like I always had identified, the first time I heard about side A and side B, I had always identified as side B because obviously I don't believe it's right for us to be, and biblically for us to be in a relationship. And actually I had one time I was on tour with a Christian artist and this lady volunteer started asking me about, am I married? Do I have a girlfriend? And I explained to her why I don't. And she's like, oh, well, you need to just find a man and be happy because the Bible says it's not good for man to be alone. And I started showing her in the Bible where it says, such were some of you and you've been redeemed. And she had never heard that before. And she called all the volunteers around and said, you got to hear what he just told me. And she now is a flight attendant and she tells my story all over the world because it's just amazing. But, God showed me when it came to this side A, side B thing. I thought side B was where we stood, ex-gay ministry stood, but I came, as you have said, that it's like a hunkering down of this identity that I'm not going to change this or I can't change. And so this is the best it's going to be. And a lot of churches have embraced gay Christianity, which is to me is just ridiculous. But God showed me, it's like when the Israelites left Egypt, they were in the wilderness. And it's like these people have side B is like they've pitched their tent in the wilderness and said, I'm fine here. I'm not going any further. And God said to me in a moment where I was in that wilderness period, he said, there's so much you can't see in the promised land, and I want to take you there. But if you pitch your tents here, it's never going to get any better than this. And I was like, okay, I'll follow you to the promised land. But I didn't know what that looked like. And it's scary because we don't know at least this is familiar and at least it may be hell, but at least it's familiar. And at least we know what to expect when you're like going out into the promised land. It's like, you don't know what to expect and what you're going to have to face. But oh my gosh, the journey that God took me through is it's so worth everything I had to face and go through to get there. But I think a lot of people, like I have a friend, her name is Michelle Pillar. She wrote a book called Untangled, and she was a Christian artist back in the 80s. And
I remember her.
Yeah, so she wrote a book about her untangling, the journey that God took her through. And she's been a huge supporter of mine and encourager of me. And she said that, few people are willing to face their stuff and deal with their stuff to find the freedom. And she has always used that to encourage me that, you keep going because so few do. And I think like I was saying, people pitch their tents and they don't want to face anything else or deal with anything else. This is good enough for me. But God has so much more for us, but he's not going to force us. We have to make the choice to follow God, or are we going to just stop where we're at, you know?
Well, that's such a powerful note, obviously, Joshua. I'm so glad that you joined us for this podcast episode.
Thank
and
you.
Your story is just amazing. God's work in your life. I can't encourage our listeners enough to get out and when your book is available. Is it available for pre-order at this
Not
point?
yet.
Or not?
Not yet.
All right. That's all right. But Identity Lost and Found. So good. Such a great title. Hey, there's two other things that as we're wrapping up here, I just want to mention, and then we've got to scoot. But I'm reminded of a couple of things from our conversation. One was we are huge fans of Katie Faust and and the work that she does in the movement of Them Before Us and the book Them Before Us. But she and her co-author also wrote a book called Raising Conservative Kids in a Woke City. They live up around Seattle. And she talks about I'm saying this really kind of for parents from some of the things we talked about earlier. I thought of it and then forgot about it until now. But one of the things that they say in that book is that second book is parents have to get to children first. In other words, we need to make sure that we are pouring in truth in God's goodness, in God's light, in God's love, but also the good things, positive things about being made little girls or little boys in the image of God. We've got to be giving our children the stability that they need to stand in places where, whether it's in public school systems or just in living in society, where those ideas are challenged. If we don't get to them first, then that kind of law of the first statement applies, where it feels like that person's the authority, and we as parents need to make sure we are. So we don't have time to get into that now, but Katie Faust is Faust. We've done a podcast with her before. If you're a parent wanting to know more about this, get her book. The other thing I think of is, and we did a podcast with her, but also with Robert Gagnon, Dr. Robert Gagnon. We did a podcast with him a number of months ago. He also, when Joshua was mentioning, well, some people say, well, the Greek doesn't really. Well, go and find Dr. Robert Gagnon's works and read into those, because he's probably the foremost theologian, certainly in our country and abroad, on the topics of the Bible and human sexuality. So a real authority there. He blows the lid off of these nonsensical ideas of kind of rewriting the scriptures according to what helps us feel good about embracing identities and behaviors that the Bible clearly calls sin. So anyway, with all of that, Joshua, we're glad that you were here, and audience, so glad that you tuned in for another episode of the Love and Truth Network podcast. We encourage you again to subscribe, share that we're here. If you're finding this information to be helpful to you, pass that around, especially to your pastors and leaders. And we look forward to seeing you at another podcast episode of the Love and Truth Network podcast. Bless you. Thank you so much for joining us for this Love and Truth Network podcast. To listen to or view future episodes, please check us out at loveandtruthnetwork.com/podcast. You may also subscribe to Apple Podcast, Spotify, or Google Music. Thank you so much, and we'll see you in a future episode.